Alright guys, we're talking about imaginary numbers today. So remember that we have been dealing with square roots and that we learned to simplify square roots. And remember that the explanation for what a square root was, or a perfect square, is literally the length of the side of a square, right? So if I have a side with length 2, or a square with side length 2, then the area of that square is 2 times 2, which is 2 squared, and that's 4. 4 is a perfect square because I took a side length of a nice, pretty whole number and I multiplied it by itself. So 4 is a perfect square. And remember that a square root is where we undo a perfect square. So square root of 4 is equal to 2. And remember that we said, well, I don't know if I started with a positive 2 or a negative 2, right? But since perfect squares, since squaring something is an area measurement, it needs to be positive because you could never have negative area. Try to imagine a square that had negative area, and that doesn't even work because the area of the square is this space right here, and how could that be negative? And so, you know, when we're talking about taking square roots in the real world with real world problems, we're talking about always having positive perfect squares. But remember that mathematicians are not always happy with what happens just in the real world. And sometimes they ask questions like, what if I wanted to take the square root of a negative number? And when they ask those questions, often they come up with very interesting answers. So the question is, how do we take the square root of a negative number? How do we take the square root of a negative number? And if you think about perfect squares, like 4, right? Think about the list of perfect squares that we had. We had 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. Those numbers are all positive. They're all positive. And in fact, you can't think of a perfect square or anything we take the square root of that's not positive. And the reason for that is that a positive number times a positive number is positive. And a negative number times a negative number is positive. So no matter what you're doing, if you're multiplying the same number by itself, right, negative 2 times negative 2, it's the same number, you're going to get something positive. What if we wanted to take the square root of a negative number? And so mathematicians asked that question and they came up with an answer. And so what they came up with is the imaginary number. And the imaginary number is the square root of negative 1. And in math, we can take the square root of negative 1 and we use a symbol to represent that square root. We call it I. So what this does for us mathematically is it opens up a whole new set of numbers for us to be able to take the square root of, to simplify square roots, to solve equations, all of these things. We can now work with numbers that we couldn't work with before, because before we were stuck with just positive numbers. And now we can take the square root of a negative number if we want. We use this symbol I. All right, so let's look at a couple examples. And hopefully that will help you guys understand what we're going to do. So if I have, for example, the square root of negative 5, Before, we would have to say, you can't take the square root of a negative number, and so I can't do that problem, and we'd have to walk away. But now that we know about this imaginary number I, what we can do is we can say, hey, I can write 5, negative 5 can be written as negative 1 times 5. And so then I can say this is the square root of negative 1 times 5, which is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5. I know the square root of negative 1. It's I. And we're taking square roots, right? So it's plus or minus I. Do I know the square root of 5? Is 5 a perfect square? It's not. And the only factors for 5 are 1 and 5. So I can't simplify it. So I leave it as the square root of 5. And that's your answer. So the square root of negative 5 can be simplified to plus or minus I root 5. If we look at the square root of negative 11, again, before we just have to say, I can't take the square root of a negative number, but now we can work with that. So we can say, I know negative 11 is equal to negative 1 times 11. So I can rewrite the square root of negative 11 as negative 1 times 11, and then I can break that apart. So it's negative 1 times the square root of 11. And the square root of negative 1 is I. I know it's I. And so this is plus or minus I. And then we ask ourselves, do we know the square root of 11? And the answer is no. 11 only factors to 1 and 11, and it's not a perfect square. So I'm just going to write it as the square root of 11, like that. And again, what this allows us to do is it allows us to solve mathematical problems that we were not able to solve before because we did not know how to take the square root of a negative number. We'd have to say, negative numbers don't have square roots. But now we know that the square root of negative 1 is I. I can simplify these things. All right. If I have the square root of negative 9, before we'd have to say, I can't take the square root of a negative number. But now I can say, hey, negative 9 is equal to negative 1 times 9. And so I can break that apart to the square root of negative 1 times 9, which is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. And I know that the square root of negative 1 is I. And then do we know the square root of 9? Yes. Yes, we do. So this is plus or minus I times 3. And the way we write this, guys, you always write it number and then I, just so that we don't get confused. And so this is written plus or minus 3I. It goes number I. The square root of negative 16 is done the same way. We know negative 16 is the product of negative 1 and 16. And so I can rewrite this as negative 1 times 16 under the square root. And then rewrite it again as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16. And this is plus or minus I times, and the square root of 16 is 4. And we write this as plus or minus 4I, like that. And that is our answer right there. Let's box these just so that it's nice and clear what our answers are. Those are our answers. So we are simplifying square roots that have negative numbers in them. All right. Let's look at the square root of negative 12. And so I can say, all right, I know negative 12 is the product of negative 1 and 12. And so I can write this as the square root of negative 1 times 12 and break that apart. Now my first two examples could not be simplified, and my second two examples were both perfect squares. 12 is not a perfect square, and it can be simplified. Remember that 12 can be factored to 4 and 3. And so this is the square root of -1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. And so I break it all apart. This is plus or minus I times the square root of 4 is 2. And then I don't know the square root of 3, so I leave it, times root 3. Now, up here we wrote it number I, and that's the way we're going to start this. It goes number I and then root. When you're putting things together, these are all being multiplied, so we're just going to write them right next to each other. When you put things together like that, and we're just writing them next to each other because of multiplication, the root always goes on the end, and it does that so that we don't get confused and accidentally put things under the square roots that shouldn't be there. So this is plus or minus 2I root 3. And that's the way it should be written, is number I root. So your answer should look exactly like mine, and it should look like this. All right, one more. Square root of -27. And so we say, all right, -27 is equal to -1 times 27. So I can rewrite this as the square root of -1 times 27, which can be rewritten as the square root of -1 times the square root of 27. And like 12, 27 can be factored. It is not a perfect square, but it can be factored. 27 is the product of 9 and 3. And so I'm going to rewrite this, and 9 is a perfect square, right? Remember, maybe go look at your perfect square list if you don't remember that, but 9 is a perfect square. This is the square root of -1 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. And so this is plus or minus I times 3, and I don't know the square root of 3. It's a prime number, which means its only factors are 3 in itself, and it's not a perfect square, so we just leave it. Now, again, this is not an acceptable answer. We need to put it in the right format, and the right format is plus or minus number I root. Plus or minus number I root. All right, so kiddos, what we learned with this is that we can, in fact, simplify square roots of negative numbers, something we didn't think we'd be able to do. We can simplify square roots of negative numbers. And how you do that is you break the negative number apart into -1 times whatever the number was. So in this case, it's -1 times 27. And by doing that, what I've done is I've freed up the 27 from being negative. Now I can just simplify the 27, which I do here. Okay. And I make the -1 the negative number. And so when I take the square root of -1, I get I. Anytime you start with a negative number under a square root, you should end up with an answer with I in it. Anytime you start with a negative number under a square root, your answer should have an I in it. If you do not start out with a negative number under the square root, your answer should not have an I. So if this 16 didn't have that negative on it, the answer would just be 4, right? Anytime you have a negative under the square root, you end up with an I. But if you don't have a negative under the square root, you do not end up with an I. You do not. All right, this is the explanation for the first few questions on your homework assignment. Go ahead and try those out and let me know if you've got questions.